If you're following along, we're at the 39th verse of Luke chapter 2, where Jesus and his parents have just had a remarkable encounter on his 8th day of life at the temple where he was going to be presented. And, well, I guess this was actually his 40th day. Anyhow, his parents encountered a prophet and a prophetess, both of whom had great things to say about this little baby. And Luke ends this little story by saying, when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own city of Nazareth. And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And here are a couple of paintings showing the imaginings of painters as to what that growing up would have looked like. But really, what did happen during Jesus' childhood? This has been a question that's always fascinated people, because our story goes from 40 days old to 12 years old to 30 years old, and there's a lot in between. And anytime you have that much interest in a subject, there will generally be people who are more than happy to tell you, even if they have to make it up. And in the early church, by the turn of the 3rd century, you had what were called infancy gospels being produced. And they would always have the name of an apostle attached to it so people would give it some credence. But the early church fathers all said these are all made up, don't take it seriously. It was never a big deal, although people loved to read this stuff. It included stories such as Jesus got mad at a playmate and struck him dead. Or he went and made a pigeon out of clay and tossed it in the air and it came to life and flew away. You know, I guess like comic book stories, I suppose would be what you would call them. Nothing to do with reality, as we will see, because Jesus' childhood was remarkably unremarkable. The oldest infancy gospels, as I mentioned, are toward the end of the 2nd century. Again, never taken too seriously. The Bible doesn't tell us much about Jesus' childhood, but we do know some things. First of all, he grew up in Nazareth, and that will call into question for some of his disciples, some of his hearers later on in his ministry, when people are skeptical that the Messiah can come from Nazareth, not knowing his origins in Bethlehem, which had been prophesied. The Bible said he had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and sisters whose names are unknown, and those are only the ones that lived to adulthood, apparently. Remember that infant mortality was pretty high back then. And on average, women had a baby about every 2 or 3 years in their fertility times. That's how often children were being born. He worked in his father's shop. As we saw last week, even though the word is consistently translated into English, carpenter's shop, the word actually is just craftsman. And it is possible he could have worked more in stone than he ever did in wood. But nevertheless, we can tell something about Jesus' upbringing when we see what happens when, as an adult, as his ministry begins, he comes back to his hometown. Here in the book of Mark, it said Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked? What's this wisdom that has been given him that he even does miracles? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. Jesus affirmed that a prophet is without honor in his hometown, and in view of that reality, he could not perform any miracles in Nazareth except for healing a few sick people. You go back home to your hometown and people are underwhelmed. That says something about how they thought of him and his upbringing. We see in the book of John that his own brothers did not believe in him, at least as far as his claims to be the Messiah, at least early on. After the resurrection, they become some of his most fervent followers. So when the Bible says, like in 1 Peter 2, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth, or in the book of Hebrews, the writer says, we have a chief priest who is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He was tempted in every way that we are, but he didn't sin. We oftentimes talk about Jesus being perfect. But what does that mean exactly? I think in the minds of many people, it means that he never lost any game he ever played. He got 100 on every test, could jump higher, stronger, better looking than everybody in the village. But that's not at all. That's not at all what the Bible seems to be saying about Jesus. The prophet Isaiah had said many years before that he grew up before God like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. I don't think that means he was homely. It just means that he was just an average person. And if his father did indeed pass away when Jesus was in his late teens or early 20s, and he's in charge of this family now, he's just kind of a guy who kept his head down, did what he was supposed to do. When people thought back on it, they couldn't think of anything that he had done sinful. But until he comes out to be in his ministry, he is unremarkable in the minds of his hometown. And I just find that very, very interesting. And it speaks to the fact of what we mean by Jesus was perfect. He was sinlessly perfect, but that's different from the kind of perfection we often attribute to people. Now it says, as we go on in the book of Luke, the next vignette in the life of Jesus, that his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. When they had finished the days, as they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother did not know it. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. Every Jewish male over the age of 12 was expected to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the great festivals. In the Old Testament, Judaism revolved around the great festivals. By the New Testament, the Sabbath day had taken on much greater meaning. It wasn't just a day to not do work, it was also a day to go to synagogue, much like you go to church, and to worship and study the Bible. In Jesus' day, Jewish people who could, everyone who was able, would go to Jerusalem for the great festivals. And these revolved somewhat around agriculture. The first one would be the Feast of the Passover, remembering the 10th plague in Egypt. And that would be kind of at the start of the barley harvest. The next great festival was the Festival of Pentecost, which came 50 days later. It was also known as the Feast of Weeks. It was supposedly when Moses received the 10 Commandments. It was considered the birthday of the Jewish religion. And so it was held in great esteem by the Jews. And so they would go to Jerusalem and gather for this as well, by the thousands. And from far away as well, as you'll see in Acts chapter 2, Jews came from all over the known world and even outside the empire to be a part of this. And the last festival was the Feast of Tabernacles, where even to this day they put together little tents, as it were, and recreate that time of wandering in the wilderness. But these were the 3 great festivals, and apparently Jesus' family's custom was to go to these, or at least to the first one, to the Passover, every year. Now, if you lived in Galilee, you had lots of Jewish people surrounding you. There were lots of Jewish people in Judea, but in between was Samaria, which was made up of people who claimed to believe in God, descendants of the Assyrian conquering. They were considered half-breeds beneath the regular Jew, and therefore to be avoided. And so if you were going from Galilee, you see the Sea of Galilee on the left there up at the top. Typically, the Jews would go down the west side of the Jordan River until they got close to Samaria. Then on that red line, they would cross over in order to avoid Samaria entirely and go down the eastern side and come back in, going up through the pass at Jericho. Other people would go as far afield as all the way to the coast on that brown line to the Roman capital of Caesarea and down that way to avoid Samaria. And there were the brave few who would gather up their strength and just go right through the center. No matter how you went, it was typically going to be at least a journey of 70 miles. And that's walking most of the way. Hardy people. And you do this maybe 3 times a year. And when you went, you didn't go as a family unit. You went both for safety and for convenience as a group, a huge extended family, more likely your neighbors, maybe most of the village. You would go in this large group all the way to Jerusalem, packing your peanut butter and jelly sandwiches the whole way to make your way there, I'm sure. It was a great group effort, and I'm sure that it was quite a joyous thing, something that everyone remembered throughout their upbringing. Now, it says that Jesus was 12 years old. Now, modern Jewish boys have a bar mitzvah when they turn 13. A Jewish girl has a bat mitzvah. It's when they become men and women, when they become adults. It's their rite of passage. But that tradition is only about 600 to 800 years old. In Jesus' time, when the rabbis typically taught, when you become 12 years old in a day, that's when you make the transition to become a man or a woman. And so by his 12th year, Jesus would have been formally apprenticed to his father, whether it was as a carpenter shown here or a stonemason. Whatever craft Joseph had, Jesus would have been tasked to learn it. You see in the upper right that he would have gone to synagogue school and learned Hebrew Scripture, how to read the text. He was expected to be able to put some of it to memory. They were very conversant with the Old Testament. As a Jewish man, he would be expected to read it, take a turn reading it at least once a year. And by the time he was 12 years and 1 day, school was over. The only time you continued after 12 years was if you intended on being a rabbi or a scribe, some sort of specialist. But by and large, you were done by 12, and you became part of what they called the minyan, the Jewish community. In order to make a synagogue in your neighborhood, in your village, in your area, it required 12 Jewish men. What is a man? Well, someone who's 12 years and a day or older. And so at 12 years and a day, he became part of the minyan, the Jewish male community that would be part of the synagogue and its ability to function. Jewish doctors of the law maintain that a boy became a son of the law at the age of 12 years and 1 day. After that, he was bound by the legal precepts. He was expected to follow the law. He didn't have the excuses. It would be what we would call the age of accountability. Often in our fellowship, we think of the age of 13 as the age of accountability, where we start looking for our young people to make the choice to be baptized. But for Jesus' time, it was 12 years and 1 day. So they go to Jerusalem. They are there for several days, and when the Passover feast is over, they leave. How do you lose a child? Now, before you judge too harshly, you have to understand the circumstances of this. First of all, remember what I said, that these were great groups of people traveling together. Modern children will never know the pleasures that I enjoyed to be able to tell my mother on a Saturday morning, I'm headed out into the woods with my dog. I'll be home at sundown. No cell phone, no way to get a hold of me. And children experienced a wide range of freedom that most mothers would not dare give their children nowadays for all the fears that we have come to have. And so it would be only natural that Jesus or many of the children would be able to roam around in the group, many of them extended family, neighbors, everybody knew everybody. Keep in mind also that quite often the men traveled separately from the women. If you go into an old church building, you will usually find one with two sets of pews, one on this side and one on this side, and an aisle down the middle. And it's an echo of how church was up until the end of the 19th century. Men sat on one side, women and children on the other, and never the twain shall meet. And it was very much like that. And so if Jesus was 12 when he goes to Jerusalem, it is possible that he went down with the women and children and could have gone up with the men, and Joseph thinks he's with Mary, and Mary thinks he's with Joseph, but nobody really has a great deal of concern here because this is happening all over Jerusalem as thousands of people return home. Being a part of an extended family or among village neighbors means that you wandered in and out among these family units as they traveled. It would probably only be at the end of the day that everybody stops and takes a head count and sees where are all the kids. And remember, by this time, it is possible that Mary and Joseph had 7 children. Remember I said every 2 years. That's a lot of kids to keep track of. And the oldest, the 12-year-old, if he's off with one of the relatives, that's okay. We got plenty to see about. Don't be too hard on Mary and Joseph. And it has happened before. I remember, I'm sad to say, one Sunday night back at our old McGregor building, I'm trying to think, we had a new baby and a 12-year-old, and somewhere in the middle we had a 7-year-old. And he had fallen asleep in service. And so when service was over, you get to fellowshipping and go around, and Mom got in the car with the baby, and I had the hyperactive 12-year-old to get him in the car. We drove all the way home and got in the house, and it's like, didn't we have 3? And we drove all the way back to the church building, and there he was, still asleep in the pew, never knew that he had been abandoned, and we never told him about his relative importance. And so we picked him up and took him home. So I can completely understand how you can accidentally lose a child. Maybe not for a whole day, but again, I wasn't back then with the kind of relaxed standards that people could afford to have. And I would assume a very pleasant way to live where you didn't have to worry every minute about where your child was. Well, thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. So what Luke is saying is that sometime during that first day, I'm thinking that the end of that first day of travel, when they counted heads, Jesus isn't there. And they look among their relatives and friends because that's where they expect him to be. There are lots of kids not with their families, with their relatives and friends. If you go to the land of Palestine today, to the unofficial capital of Ramallah, there is the Church of the Holy Family, which supposedly is built on the site where Jesus and Mary went, oh my goodness, we've lost Jesus. And so they built a church building there to commemorate that event. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Now, I would not want to be a fly on the wall on that conversation all the way back to Jerusalem, because it is human nature for people to blame one another. That could have gotten unsightly, and you could imagine the back and forth that might have been going on there. But imagine when you get to a city that after the festival, people have left. During the festival, the city may swell to 500,000 people. And then it goes back to its normal population, which is somewhere around 100,000. That's a huge place. If you're from a village of 300, this is incredible. How are you going to find a boy there? And how do you know he's there and not somewhere along the way? You can imagine their frantic worry, the blame that goes on between the two of them, the frustration and the fear, because they don't just find him in 20 minutes. Now so it was that after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. Now, keep in mind that the turns of phrase in the Bible when it comes to time are not necessarily the way that we describe time. What Luke is saying is that on the third day, in the same way that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Jesus is crucified, buried, and rises from the dead, you and I might not describe that as 3 days, but they would think of it that way. And so it could be 48 hours in our way of thinking, but for them, 3 separate days had passed, and I just can't imagine what's going through my mind or how long I would continue this search in this huge city trying to find a boy. They find him in the temple. Now, specifically, they find him in the temple courts. The temple was like, you have to think of it like the concentric rings of a bullseye. The most central part was the holy place, which only the priests could be around it. The next ring was where the Jewish men over the age of 12 could approach. Then the court of women, then the court of the Gentiles. Some of these outer courts are where rabbis would stand and teach or sit and teach, and this must have been where they found Jesus. Although how they could find him in the midst of all that, well, just frantic, just incredible. And he is sitting with the rabbis. Now, the teachers, the men who took upon themselves the vocation of professional teachers, even their posture meant something. If you read through the book of Acts or the Gospels, you'll see where someone stands up in the synagogue to read the Scriptures, and then they sit down to comment. And it's a sign of respect. What God has to say, you stand up for. Nothing you have to say is on a level with God, and you fold it and you sit down. And that's what they're doing, sitting there talking about the teaching of the rabbis. And they are teaching in what we would call an Aristotelian way. I'll ask a question and you give an answer, then you ask a question and I'll give an answer. There's a back and forth there. And the fact that a 12-year-old boy can do that is of some, you can see the rabbis, Joe, come and look at this. I mean, this is remarkable. Not to mention the fact that the boy's accent will give him away as a Galilean. This is a hick from the sticks doing this. Come and see this. You won't believe what's going on here. He was asking them questions, interacting with them almost as an equal, and it was a marvelous thing to these older men. In some senses, then, they would have looked at Jesus as a child prodigy. A child prodigy is someone who is exceptionally good at something, even better than adults who've been doing it for a long time. Now, I hasten to add that I don't think Jesus was doing this back home in Nazareth. Because remember, the people later will think, there was nothing remarkable about him growing up. I think this is rather unique. And one of the reasons that his parents are so puzzled at this behavior. So when they saw him, they were amazed. His parents were amazed, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I have sought you anxiously." They are genuinely perplexed. If you had told them, well, he's with the food stalls, or he is looking at the monkey over there, they might have believed that. But in the temple, talking to the rabbis, I just think they're astounded. Are they aggravated? Well, my parents, if I had wandered away, it would have been one of those times where you don't know whether to hug them or wring their neck. You just know, human nature being what it is, it just must have been a very frustrating time. And they point to his seeming lack of concern for them. Did not you give a thought about us and what we might think? Your father, and notice that Mary refers to Joseph as his father, his legal title. Your father and I have sought you anxiously. And Jesus' answer is very interesting. And he said to them, why do you seek me? Do you not know that I must be about my Father's business? But they did not understand the statement which he spoke to them. He is perplexed at their perplexity. Why in the world are you worried about me? I am about my Father's business. And I think just all the gears here mesh with Mary and Joseph, and they're not quite sure what to do. They're thankful, obviously, to have this child back, but this is a remarkable turn of events. And is this going to be repeated? Apparently not, I guess. But it does, it is a glimpse of things to come.